Hi, everybody, and welcome to this live session. And in this session, hopefully about 30 minutes or possibly more if there are any questions, we're going to be looking at how the examiner is marking your writing and what they're listening for during the speaking. So we're going to have a look at each of the parts of the exam that are really a bit more complicated than the other parts, the listening, the use of English, and the reading, where your answers are either wrong or right. In the speaking and writing, an examiner, will be looking and listening at those parts. And as they're reading your essay or report, they're going to be looking at certain criteria. And the same goes for the speaking. As you're speaking with your partner during the speaking exam that goes on for about 14 minutes, the assessor, that's the person who sat behind the interlocutor, they're going to be listening also for specific criteria and giving you a mark on those. So if you are watching, do let me know where you're watching from. And if you have any questions, we'll deal with those a little bit later, but please do put them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them shortly. So first of all, let's talk about speaking. Let's talk about speaking. So hopefully you can see this if I write on the board. I hope it's big enough and clear enough for you to see. Now, the speaking is worth 20% of your overall B2 first mark. And 20 is also the number of points that the examiner or the assessor will be awarding to your spoken performance. And the speaking criteria specifically looks at 4 different things, and each of those you can get a score of up to 5 points. So, as I said, there are a total of 4 criteria that the assessor is listening for. Now, the first one is called grammar and vocabulary. Now, grammar and vocabulary is a little bit more complicated than it is in the use of English part. In the use of English, you're examined specifically on individual structures and word formations, etc. In the speaking, the grammar and vocabulary comes down to your accuracy, your appropriacy, and your range. Now, what do we mean by those? So first of all, let's look at grammar. Now, you're doing a B2 level exam, which means you need to demonstrate to the assessor that you have a B2 level of grammar and grammatical knowledge. So if you speak mostly in basic structures like present simple and short sentences, the examiner is not going to be able to award you that many points. For B2, you are expected to understand and to be in control of a wide range of grammatical structures. So that means during the speaking exam, you need to find opportunities to demonstrate to the examiner all of the tenses, all of the structures, all of the things like relative clauses, things like phrasal verbs, cleft sentences, so that the examiner can feel confident that you have a B2 level grammar and grammatical knowledge. And of course, it's very tempting during the exam to keep it safe, to play it safe and to stick to what you know, which is okay, but if you're going to be simple with your structures, then you're not going to score more than 1 or 2 points in the grammar and vocabulary section. So what we need to be thinking about doing is being flexible. So in every answer, try to vary your tenses, vary your grammatical structures so that the examiner can get a taste of each of the grammar that you know and that you have spent the past few years learning. For vocabulary, on the other hand, you're going to be talking about what Cambridge regard as familiar topics. Things like the environment, work, life, education, the topics, again, that you learn about during your B2 preparation classes. So in the specific speaking tasks, you need to be able to demonstrate that you know those specific words connected to those topics. And of course, you also need to be very careful not to repeat your words, not just repeat your own words over and over again, but also try not to repeat the words that the examiner has asked you in the question. So part of the grammar and vocabulary mark is about paraphrasing or rephrasing, taking the question that the examiner asks you and responding in your own words, using synonyms, using words or phrases that give the same meaning but aren't repetitive of the words from the question. Of course, for grammar and vocabulary, during the speaking exam, it's okay to make a few mistakes. In natural speech, even native speakers, when they're speaking, make mistakes because we are unable to spend a lot of time thinking before we speak. So a few mistakes is not a problem, but if you are using wrong words and wrong grammatical structures during your answer, and it's clear that you're making a mistake and that you're not aware that it is a mistake, then of course you won't score that highly in that particular part. But don't worry too much about the speaking, because the grammar and vocabulary here is only worth 5 points maximum from the 20 that are available. So a few mistakes is fine. Now, the next section of speaking criteria that the assessor is listening for is something called discourse management. Now, it's a very strange term to use, but what it basically means is that you can control what you say. Again, the key word here is management. Can you manage the discussion? Can you develop your ideas? If you're answering a question, whether you agree or disagree, the discourse management is about expanding on your answer with a clear example so that the assessor can really understand that you are supporting that answer. And of course, in other parts of the speaking exam, especially part 3 and part 4, where you're interacting with your partner and with the examiner, discourse management basically means that you can move the conversation forward, that you are not going around in a circle and repeating the same point and the same argument over and over again. So it's really here about strategically that you're able to move the conversation forward. Now, the next criteria that is important in speaking, again, maximum 5 points here, is pronunciation. Now, there's a lot of confusion over what pronunciation actually means, and before we get to what it is, let's talk about what it isn't. It's not about your accent. So don't worry, you're not expected to sound like a native British person or an American. No. What pronunciation comes down to are basically two things: that what you say is clear enough that the listener can understand and that they can follow what you're saying. So you're pronouncing the words as they should be pronounced, or at least as closely as possible to the way that they should be pronounced. But it's absolutely not connected to accents. In fact, if you have a very strong accent, that is perfectly acceptable as long as your words, your sentences, your phrases are clear for the listener to follow. And the other part of pronunciation that's quite important is about stress and intonation. So what this means is that you shouldn't sound like a robot, you shouldn't sound like you are translating in your head, but that you are speaking with a natural flow and a natural pace, and that you're stressing the important words in the sentence. And of course, this also includes your intonation that goes up for a question and down for a statement. So 5 points for grammar and vocabulary, 5 points for discourse management, 5 points for pronunciation. And the last 5 points basically go to something called interactive communication. Now, as you know, in the speaking exam, there are 4 parts. Part 1 and part 2, you're basically answering questions directly from the examiner to the examiner. But in part 3 and part 4, you're speaking with your partner and you're interacting also with the examiner. So for interactive communication, you are really focusing here on parts 3 and parts 4, where you are speaking with your partner, you're listening to your partner, and you're interacting with your partner. So to get the 5 points here, what you need to be doing is showing that you're an active listener. So as your partner is speaking, you remain silent, but you need to demonstrate to the examiner that you are listening. And of course, the best way to do that is to pick up on something that your partner has said and comment on it, or develop the idea further, or agree or disagree. Do something that shows the assessor that you understand what your partner has been saying. And of course, in part 3, especially where you are discussing those 5 elements of a particular question, the interactive communication here might also include things like interrupting your partner and reacting quickly to something that they've said. Again, this can be by very, very short phrases like absolutely and I don't think so. Phrases like that really help your discourse management. And of course, discourse management as well, it is, sorry, interactive communication. Interactive communication also is about knowing when to speak and knowing when not to speak. So, for example, in part 4, the discussion, if you have given your comment or your answer to the examiner, your interactive communication here involves allowing your partner to speak. So it involves also taking it in turns to speak as part of the discussion. Okay, so that's basically what we need to be thinking about doing during the speaking part of the exam. Remember, it's a very, very short part of the exam. It's the shortest. It's only 14 minutes. Most students I've had say that the exam goes way, way, way too quick, which is why it's all the more important to be aware of what the assessor is listening for as you are speaking. So again, just to summarize here, grammar and vocabulary, yes, it's important, but it's 5 points from the 20. Grammar and vocabulary, we're talking about two main things. Firstly, using the appropriate grammar and vocabulary for the question and for the situation. And secondly, showing off, demonstrating lots of different types of structures and lots of different words, phrases, phrasal verbs, idioms, etc. Discourse management, move the conversation forward. Develop your points, develop your arguments, support your ideas. Pronunciation, be clear and be natural. Stress the words that need to be stressed. Stress the syllables that need to be stressed. And finally, interactive communication, specifically in parts 3 and part 4 of the speaking exam. Interact naturally with your partner. Allow them time to speak. Show that you have been listening. Interact with them. Don't make it sound like it's this person speaking, then me speaking, that they are two separate things. No, it's interactive. So demonstrate that to the examiner. Okay, so before we move on to the writing, if anyone's watching, do you have any questions about the speaking? So if you do, please do write them in the chat box under or next to the video, and we'll deal with those as they come up. It doesn't look like it. If you are watching the replay and you have any questions, please do write them in the comments. I'll be coming back and answering those if and when those happen. So in the meantime, let's move on now to no. Yes. Yes, let's move on to the writing. Okay, so I'm going to erase the board. And I'm going to get my notes for the writing. Okay. All right. So the writing part of the exam, just like the speaking, it's also worth 20% of the overall B2 first grade. And just like the speaking, there are 4 criteria that the examiner is looking for as they're reading your writing. So, and by the way, just like the speaking, the writing is an overall mark. So you're not going to get a separate mark in the writing for part 1 and a separate mark for writing part 2. It's viewed as one whole piece. So just like the speaking, you have the 4 parts, but you don't receive individual grades for each of those parts. You receive an overall score. So the writing, as you know, there are 2 tasks: the essay that is compulsory, and part 2 where you have a choice, and the choice may include a review, a report, an email or letter, or an article. So, excuse me. So the 4 criteria that we talk about with writing are, first of all, content. Now, content basically means the task. Have you answered the question? Have you included what the examiner wants you to include? If this is the essay, the content means, have you answered the question and have you developed the 3 points? Remember the first 2 points that they give you, and have you supplied your own idea? For the part 2, the review, for example, there may be a couple of points to include the information about what you're reviewing and why you would recommend it. So you need to include exactly what was requested in the task. Similar to speaking here, but evaluated in a slightly different way, we have communicative achievement. Now, communicative achievement is understanding the format, understanding that an essay is academic, understanding that the style of writing for a particular reader should be in a certain way. So, for example, the essay is always for your English teacher. So the tone, the vocabulary, the phrases that you use, they should all be not too formal. They should be kind of neutral to formal, because this is your English teacher. You've known her or him for a while, and it's one person that you know. So the tone should be not too academic. It should be quite neutral. And more importantly, when the examiner sees your piece of writing, it should look like an essay. So it should be divided into those paragraphs, and it should feel, without reading it, that this is an essay. Speaking of paragraphs, next criteria is called organization. And this is basically your paragraphs. When you write a piece of writing, it has to be separated into parts. If it's the essay, it'll be the introduction, point 1, point 2, point 3, and conclusion. If it is the review, again, it'll be some background, some information about the setting, and the recommendation. Likewise, if it's a report, it might include titles, the problem, the solutions, and the recommendations, again, with clear titles. Again, it must be separated. Organization is about separation, but it's also about bringing it together. So if you are writing the essay, for example, yes, you're writing paragraphs, but those paragraphs should not be separate and exist on their own. They should connect to each other. So for organization, this is where you're going to be using things like conjunctions and linking words, so that your piece of writing will flow in one direction, that you'll have obviously an overall topic that you're talking about, but that each paragraph has its own point of view, but it's all connected. So think about linking to the next paragraph, but also think about connecting back to the previous paragraph. And the final 5 points is, and now don't ask me why, for the writing, Cambridge call language, which is again grammar and vocabulary. In the speaking, it's called grammar and vocabulary, but for some reason in the writing, it's called language. Now, language is grammar and vocabulary, and exactly the same as what we looked at in the speaking. It's about using the specific words in the right place. If it's an essay, for example, on the environment, then of course you're expected to use words and phrases connected to that topic. So, global warming, community, polar ice caps, climate change, etc. For grammar, again, it's about showing a range. It's about showing that you can use all the different tenses, that you can connect those again through clauses, relative clauses, for example, through adverbial clauses, so that this really is like a showroom, a full demonstration of all the grammar and vocabulary that you've learned over the years as you've been preparing for the B2 first. So 20%, 20 points, 5 points for content. Have you answered the question? Have you included everything that the examiner wanted you to include? And have you not included what they don't want to include? Communicative achievement. Does the essay look like an essay? Does the report look like a report? Does it follow the conventions of that piece of writing? If it's a letter to a friend, of course, it's going to be friendly. It's going to be contractions. It has to have that to demonstrate that you understand that particular type of writing. Organization, separate into paragraphs, but connect the paragraphs together. Make it flow, make it easy to read for the examiner. And finally, language. This is your time to really show off the fancy words and grammatical structures that you've been studying so hard for. So that's basically it. For the other parts of the B2 first exam, for the use of English, for the reading and for the listening, it's straightforward. It's simply right or wrong. And in fact, most of those are just able to be read by machines, but a human is still required for the writing and the speaking. And this is where they rely on the criteria that's given by Cambridge Assessment English to evaluate your performance. So for each of the criteria, they'll be giving you a maximum of 5 points to give a total of 20. Now, remember, 20 points is the absolute maximum, but the pass mark is 60%. So 60%, oh God, why have I done this on live? 60% of 20, I believe, is 12, which basically means you don't need 5 in each of these. In fact, if you do, that'd be great. In fact, you would come out with a C1. But what you do need in order to pass is 12 points, which basically means 3 points for each of these. That is the target. Okay, so at this point, again, if we have any questions, please do write them in the chat box and then we can respond to them. If not, if you are watching a replay, please do feel free to ask a question and I'll be coming around and I'll type the answers. Okay, but thank you everybody for watching. It's been I think quite a productive 30 minutes. Oh, look at that, 30 minutes. That's exactly what we were planning. So as I said, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe to the channel. We'll be doing a few more live videos similar to this, and also hopefully very, very soon some live lessons as well to help you prepare for the B2 first. So thank you everybody so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.